So with that, I am thrilled to introduce the president of Comtech, Dawn Stephen, and Rick Page with Bluestream. So Dawn, it's all yours as soon as I stop sharing. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining myself and Rick. We have been talking about this for a few months of getting together and having a discussion about the word taxonomy, and then talking about how that can actually be implemented. But that we're going to really spend some time today talking about what do we mean by the word taxonomy. It's an interesting word, and people use it to mean a variety of different things. So we're going to talk about the entire spectrum and take a look at what our different options are. As Kathy introduced already, my name is Dawn Stevens. I am the president and owner of Comtech, the director of CIDM, and I've been working in this industry since I was 3. No, but I have a lot of experience in information development and taxonomy in particular. Now we've been really focusing on that aspect of technical communication for probably the last decade now, where we have seen more and more of the more information is out there, the harder it is for people to find, and the more important it is for us to organize things. So that's who I am. Rick, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself before we get started?
I can do. Thank you, Dawn. My name's Rick Page. I work for Bluestream. I look after sales and marketing primarily, and I've been doing this for not as long as Dawn, I have to say, but it still feels like a long time. And I should just mention that this is a 2-part webinar. We've got today, Dawn's going to dive into the whole taxonomy spectrum, and we're going to follow this up next month with a webinar that I'm going to lead, and then we'll look into what the technologies are and how they support what we're going to discuss today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dawn for the main event.
Yes, largely you will be hearing from me this time, and then we encourage you to join us again in a month, where you'll hear more about Rick and see a lot more practical applications of what I'm going to talk about today. So what is it that I'm going to talk about today? Well, we're talking about this word taxonomy, and what do we mean by that? Typically, when everybody is talking about the word taxonomy, they do mean that we're talking about some kind of organization system, some kind of way that we are classifying our information, our content, based on some common characteristics, some common terminology, typically to allow ourselves and our users to be able to locate information readily, right? So it's useful for us to define what is and what isn't in our content domain, so we can understand the scope of our content based on what is in our taxonomy, what terminologies, what categories will give us a clue as to are we talking about this type of thing or not within our overall content. It helps us, again, locate information, whether we're talking about our own authors and our repositories, whether we're talking about our delivery mechanisms. It helps our users be able to locate specific information by applying the taxonomy in a variety of different ways. We're talking about metadata, but we also may be talking about just menu structures, navigation, folder structures in your repository. All of those may be manifestations of this word taxonomy. We're talking about relationships between all of our different pieces of content, and what can be explicitly stated through our taxonomy, what can be implied through a taxonomy. And so our taxonomy runs this whole gamut from a very high level, very general, maybe categories of types of information, to very, very specific terminology lists and so on. So the problem here is that when we're talking about taxonomy, there's an irony here in that this is a word that means how we're going to organize information. It includes terminology, and very exacting terminology in some cases. And yet when we tend to use the word taxonomy in this industry, everybody means something different, right? One man's taxonomy is another woman's thesaurus. And we have a lot of different words that we might use to really mean taxonomy. We tend to focus on that word taxonomy, but if somebody comes to me as a consultant and they say, we need you to help us create our taxonomy, my very first question is going to be, what do you mean? please define the word taxonomy, because there is such a spectrum. So what we're going to be talking about here today is what I'm calling the taxonomy spectrum, that takes us from some of the most basic sides of things, this left-hand side, the controlled vocabulary, and as we increase complexity, takes us all the way up to this idea of a relational ontology. And so as you scan this spectrum here and see these terms, controlled vocabulary, synonyms, taxonomy, thesaurus, facets, all of those are words that oftentimes are used interchangeably, but that I want to give some good definitions to. They are increasing complexity, so what do you need? What are you trying to accomplish? We're going to talk about the pros and the cons of each part of this spectrum, how they're used, to give you some idea of what do you mean when you say taxonomy, so you can really focus on what kind of development you need to do as you're creating that. So we're going to start at the most simplest level here of talking about a controlled vocabulary. And what we're talking about when we talk about a controlled vocabulary is ultimately just a list of terminology. It is some kind of mandated, predefined list that you have created as the owners of your content to say, these are the terms, this is the vocabulary that we use in our content, that we use when we're talking about our products, about our services, whatever you're documenting. These are the standard preferred terms that we're going to use. In this list of controlled words, there's no synonyms, there's no overlap. This is our chosen word. This is the word that we're going to use whenever we're referring to this particular thing, this definition. There's no relationships associating words in this controlled vocabulary. It is literally just a list of terms that we're going to use. An example, as you see here, the double core metadata is a list of terms to describe resources that you might use within web resources, so video and images and web pages and so forth. That the double core metadata is a controlled vocabulary to describe those types of things. Another example, let's just take a look at the Hallmark site. Now, the Hallmark site does have, we'll talk about the fact that there's a hierarchy here. We have some initial categories, but once we get into a category, we see a controlled vocabulary. So controlled vocabulary is oftentimes used as we increase in our complexity along the taxonomy to define specific parts of our hierarchy, specific terms we're going to use in our facets and so on, but it can also just be that list. And so as we look at the Hallmark site, we see they have a defined vocabulary of who are potential recipients of their cards. And so this is their list. These are choices that we have. This is their list. And we can, of course, potentially criticize this and say, well, what does that mean in terms of I want to send a card to my aunt and I don't see aunt here as a choice. Potentially what that's telling us is that as we talk about the scope of our controlled vocabulary, potentially aunts and uncles aren't included in the scope of their cards. They don't have specific cards for aunt and uncle. Now, I think that's probably wrong, and so maybe we could also be saying their controlled vocabulary is not complete, but that's what I mean by saying it really helps us define our scope. We see by this list of words, these are the people that they have said are our list of specific words that describe recipients. Right? We don't have a lot of overlap here, but there may be some ambiguities here. Something like mother, well, is mother just meaning your mother? Does it your natural mother? Does it mean your stepmother? Could, if you were looking for a card for a new mother, not your own, would that fall in there? So there are potentially some questions that the controlled vocabulary doesn't exactly answer just because of its various limitations. But what we can see is that we're going to talk, we're going to use the word father. We're not going to use the word dad. We're not going to use the word pa. Any of those types of things, we get the idea of these are the words that Hallmark has chosen to use when describing their specific products. So that is a controlled vocabulary. So why do we have one? Largely, it's a consistency issue. It is to help our authors in the first place know what are our preferred terms, what words should we be using as we write, taking out any questions about variant spellings or that type of thing, or just the different types of words. If we look at this image here, what is being poured really depends on what area of the world, or even in the United States, what area of the United States you're in. I grew up calling it pop. My children call it soda. What is this thing that is being poured? We have a lot of potential synonyms here right now with the idea of a controlled vocabulary. We would be choosing, this is the term that we're going to use, whether it's a popular term, whether it's a scientific term, whether it's just a random choice between all of the different synonyms. That's what we're doing here in our controlled vocabulary. So that removes a lot of the ambiguity of which term do we choose when, what term means this particular thing. And it, again, defines our overall scope of what we are talking about. So that's the purpose of our controlled vocabulary. And so the advantages of that is that it really helps our writers make that consistent choice. Right? Researchers at Bell Labs found that the probability that two people would describe an object with the exact same words to be less than 20%. Right? So if we leave everybody to their own devices, we potentially have a lot of creative writing and a lot of different words that might be used to describe something. So our advantages are for writing ease and consistency, that we're going to have our writers using the same terminology, which, assuming that we get our users to use that same terminology, helps from a findability perspective as well. It's very easy for us to create automatic enforcement when we have a controlled vocabulary of writing rules, schematron rules, of using some of our automated checkers to say, hey, if somebody types a different word, we can prompt them of, no, this isn't your preferred term, you should use that word instead in your writing. That, of course, leads to translation savings, where we know we're using only one word. We can take more advantage of things like translation memory on those word choices, and ultimately helps to, again, assuming that our users know what they're looking for, reduce the number of irrelevant items that we might have in a search. There's only one word that you're looking for. We're not going to have a lot of different synonyms and things like that coming into our search. So that could be good. It could also be a disadvantage, right? If our users don't know the words that we've chosen in our controlled vocabulary, then potentially they're not going to find anything. That their choices, if all we've implemented is a controlled vocabulary, their choices may not match ours, and so they're not going to find those words potentially in our content. Controlled vocabulary can be difficult to keep updated. It can go out of date rapidly, especially in fast developing fields of knowledge, where there's new terms, better terms, more specific terms being developed as you go along. Oh, it's better to refer to things this particular way. So it can be hard to keep updated. The choice itself can be very political. As we've helped organizations develop their taxonomy, we have seen very politically charged arguments about, well, who has the appropriate authority to decide which the term should be. Is it in the purview of technical writers? Is it in the purview of the SMEs, of the marketing team, etc.? Who should make that choice, and are they, when they disagree, and are they making the right choice when we consider our users? It's, of course, a disadvantage in that there's no groupings or relationships. It's just this list, and it can be hard to make any rhyme or reason out of a long list of terms. It's certainly preferred to have some kind of groupings just for us to be able to make sense of this list. So it can be difficult to manage from that perspective. And there's no flexibility here. This is the word you use, right? And so we oftentimes feel tied down, that our creativity is being maybe infringed upon by this uh, minimal list of words that we can choose. All right, so as we move forward then, down this spectrum, we leave the controlled vocabulary, we expand it a little bit by moving into a synonym ring. So what we're now going to take is our controlled list of words, and we are going to create lists of equivalent, interchangeable terms for those preferred terms. So we see here in the image that now we have all of those things, what is being poured, and some additional things here of more terms that might be here that we're going to accept as synonyms. If somebody was looking for this particular item, we would let them use any of these words and potentially find a match. Now, oftentimes in a synonym ring, terms are not even what we would consider true synonyms. If we look at this list and we kind of focus on the word Coke, right? Now, again, in the South, I know that Coke is used not to necessarily refer to a brand name, but I look at that and I say, you know, that is a brand name. It's not really a synonym per se of soda or pop. It is a brand, but in our defined synonym ring, we have chosen to say, yeah, we're going to include a brand name as a synonym. So you have a lot of control over, is it really a true synonym? Is it a colloquialism? Is it, is it a brand? However you want to choose those synonyms certainly are within your purview. Now, the big value of a synonym is that if we start thinking about metadata tagging, synonyms are really used only from the retrieval side of things, not the tagging. Right? We're going to implement the synonym ring into our search engines. Our search engines will understand somebody types pop. We're going to give all of the feed all of the possible content for soda as well, even though that's not what they typed. And we don't have to tag our content with both words. We can keep it with our primary controlled vocabulary and then add the synonym functionality into our search engines to be able to improve that retrieval. So example, don't know if any of you are, probably several of you are from California, so I apologize that I have referred to it as La La Land here, but here are a possible set of synonyms that people could be entering if they were looking for the state of California that we've decided. So they ran the gamut of abbreviations, nicknames, colloquialisms, again, all sorts of things that we could choose to put in to our list of what is a synonym for, in this case, California. So why do we have a synonym ring? Ultimately, it is the equivalent of making our users enter each of these words and search for them. So rather than have to say, well, I searched for pop, I didn't find anything, so now I have to think of a new word. Oh, I'll search for soda and I'll look for things. We're letting them have multiple searches on the exact same word all at one time. So they don't need to know our preferred term. We're going to anticipate what other words they may use so that they get a richer set of results with words that they may never have considered or ultimately have thought of at all when they do that search. Now, the advantages, of course, is that it does provide more search results. And so therefore it addresses those common complaints that you hear of, I can't find what I'm looking for. I trust that you have it somewhere on your website. I have not been able to find the appropriate combination of words to locate what it is that I'm looking for. So I can't find it, or maybe even I don't get any hits at all. Complaint, right? But that's one of those common complaints that people hear from their users about their information, is that they can't find what they're looking for. And so expanding the number of hits by having synonym rings is one way to address that issue. It does also, because they might enter a synonym, but it takes them to content that then uses the preferred term that you would like them to be using. It will reinforce that correct term, and ultimately then they'll learn that vocabulary that you want them to use. Now, the disadvantages is that there are more search results, right? It's an advantage. It's also a disadvantage because we may get some potentially irrelevant things. And it could, if your opposite complaint if I don't get any hits is I get so many and I don't know how to filter through them. I can't figure out which is the appropriate one for me. Now we're adding additional hits because of the synonyms, and users can ultimately be confused by why do I have so many hits, including ones that don't even include my search term. Right, so if you're looking at a search engine and it's highlighting the word that you entered, showing that in the short description and the title, that type of thing, and then you're getting hits because of synonyms and nothing is being highlighted, that could be confusing as to why did I get that hit. And again, it's not always clear what constitutes a synonym. Why did I get a match for this when I didn't? I don't see the relationship between that particular term and this other term that I'm now getting a match for. So there could be confusion if we really haven't done a good audience analysis of what are the synonyms in our industry for this particular term. Right. Continuing our move down the complexity, we hit this what's typically considered taxonomy. It's this hierarchical structure of terms. So we have terms, we have categories that are arranged in some kind of two-dimensional order that we have broader terms at the top, we have narrower terms at the bottom. It's typically expressed, as we see in the image, of just as a tree, and that terms within a specific branch share similar traits as their ancestors. Right. So here's an example of a hierarchy of transportation. We can divide our transportation into 3 types of transportation, and then depending on each of those individual those traits, we can further subdivide them down. And so we understand that transportation is our broader category. We've subdivided into land, water, and air. That's slightly narrower in that area of transportation, and we continue to narrow as we look at the land of the different types of vehicles that can provide transportation on land, and then we can even further subdivide. What we can see here in this hierarchy is that while they do share potentially commonalities with the parent, we can also see just in this illustration that the traits themselves may be different in each branch, right? So if we look at train, the subdivision of train has been where is the train located, above or underground, right? Rather than doing something like maybe saying subway or high-speed train or things like that. We've just gone with where are they operated, whereas in automobile, we've more talked about types of automobiles, maybe related to kind of to size, for example. So completely different categories of subdivision here within our tree, and that is generally accepted. That we're not going to use necessarily the same criteria to subdivide in each area that as we go down. We're just really concerned with this is broader, this is narrower, etc. Right? Now, certainly it's easier to traverse and understand a hierarchy if we can use the same criteria in each of the different branches, but it's oftentimes what we find in a hierarchical expression is that we don't have that level of consistency. So why do we have a hierarchy? Because it is it establishes at least that simple relationship between all the terms in our controlled vocabulary. So each of the words that are there in our hierarchy that represent a node in the hierarchy is a controlled vocabulary. It is the word that we want people to be using when they get to that point in the relationship. But the hierarchy gives us that way to traverse those terms and understand them, subdivide them in our own heads so that we get an idea of what is really the scope of this content by looking at this hierarchy without having to maybe solve a word problem by looking at a whole bunch of words that are seemingly unrelated because they haven't been related for us. And by putting those relationships in, we have a better idea of really seeing the scope and the idea of the designers of the content of how they really categorized information. So our users can better understand our domain if we expose this hierarchy in some way. So the advantages of a hierarchy is it gives us, of course, that structure and context to the terms. It's a good illustration showing the relationships between each of these items. And it helps from a predictability perspective, as long as our mind, the way our minds work are the same way as our users' minds work. They can predict what they're going to see. They can make logical guesses about, okay, if I drill down farther into this particular category, I expect to see these types of things. A tree is very familiar representation. People understand how to move through it, so it's easy to understand. And it does give us some type of disciplined organization, that we are spending the time to really think, where do things belong? How are we going to categorize things uniquely into these various portions of our tree? Now, the disadvantages of that is, as I was saying, oftentimes there's a lack of consistency in the relationships. It's narrower, but how is it narrower? We also run into many situations where we end up with this idea of a polyhierarchy, is that a term could have more than one parent. Where do we put it? In fact, in this example, where we are subdividing pants, the clothing pants, right? We have categories down here, dress pants, for example, that show up in every single one of these things. In fact, we could draw this tree differently, where we only have a single node called dress pants that would point to all three of these other higher level categories. So we have that polyhierarchy, and that could be an advantage. As from a user perspective, I don't know which of these categories, but it doesn't really matter. I still get to it. It could be disadvantaged in some ways as well, that it's confusing to know where we should be going. The hierarchy is a single dimension. We're going up and down it. We can't go side by side. So it is limiting from establishing those relationships, but it does give you something to do that. And then the way you categorize the content may not make sense. The way we organize the tree, it may not make sense. Again, if we look at these pants, the choice here was, say, okay, we're going to go to men's, women's, and children. Well, first of all, our division is by gender for 2 categories, and then by age for the 3rd category. So, okay, what does that mean? When does a kid stop becoming a kid and become a woman or a man? I mean, there's a lot of confusion that we could have just in that piece of it, that our users might go, I don't know where to look for my 13-year-old daughter, right? I don't consider her a woman. I don't consider her a kid. Where do I look? So maybe we've missed a category, that type of thing. So it might be hard for them to traverse there. It may not make sense that we do have all these subcategories of dress and casual and so forth. Maybe that should have been the first one. If you're looking for pants, well, what kinds of pants? You want to look for casual pants or dress pants, and it doesn't matter what age you are, right? Somebody might have organized it that way instead. So there's a lot of still decisions and potentially politics, just in terms of what's the most important thing. How are we going to continue to narrow it? And again, your user might be thinking of it in a different way. So really understanding how your users would best divide these and want to search or traverse the tree is going to be one of your critical factors as you design that taxonomy. So we can add some additional levels of relationship by moving down our taxonomy spectrum to a thesaurus, which has everything that we were talking about from a hierarchy, but now we've added some additional networked terms. So you've got your synonyms and you've got your related terms in your thesaurus as well. So a thesaurus is going to help establish context, where we have a word like pool. Are we talking about swimming pools? Are we talking about billiards? Are we talking about the old school secretarial pool? What is the context in which we are looking for this particular term, and establishing what its synonyms and relationships are? So the thesaurus is going to give us that context. It's going to provide those equivalent terms. It's still going to give us broader and narrower terms like we saw in hierarchy, and it's also going to build this ability to start to have related terms to what you have. So as an example here, we see it all the time, right? When you're buying something from Amazon or a bookstore or something like that, we see here this box I've got related to the items that I've used. So if I was looking at taxonomy books, now it's giving me a whole set of, here are things that are related to this, because I know that you were looking at taxonomy, at books. I can say, yeah, here's some other taxonomy books. I can also start to bring in things like information architecture, which is a related field, right? Because in our thesaurus, behind the scenes here, we've established what those relationships are. It's not just necessarily, oh yeah, I have the exact match of, I have some things that are tagged as taxonomy books, but I have architecture books, and I know that there is a relationship that's been established in my taxonomy that taxonomy books would be related to architecture books. So we see that kind of application all the time, especially on things like shopping sites. So why do we have the thesaurus? Again, really to be able to handle our synonyms and our associated terms, as well as just that hierarchical relationship. So, here we see, again, another example of context of what kind of thing are we talking about when we're talking about Turkey. And so we can establish that context and then give ourselves related words to that particular context. We're also looking at associations that aren't direct against synonyms, right? So this idea of like field and object of study. So we could relate that we have a field of cardiology, and then we would relate, a related term might be heart, right? Heart is not a synonym of cardiology. Heart is not really a narrower word in the idea of terminology. So it's really not a tree thing that I would want to see there, but it is related. And that's what the thesaurus is doing. Process and agent, we might talk about. We have a process for termite control. One of the ways you might control termites would be something like a pesticide. So again, pesticides, not necessarily a synonym of termite control. It's not necessarily a subdivision of it, but it is a related term. Concepts and their properties. I might talk about the toxicity of a poison. Right? It's an attribute. It's a related term there. Actions and product of actions. I might talk about indigestion when I'm talking about eating as my higher action. Concepts and causal dependence. I might say, well, we've got the concept of a celebration, and so why do I have a celebration? I have a celebration because it's New Year's Eve. I have a celebration because it's a birthday, that type of thing. So again, those related terms are all established through the use of a thesaurus. So the advantages of the thesaurus is that we do get these additional relationships that may not be obviously apparent to our users. It still gives us the synonyms, so it helps the users who don't know the right terms, who aren't searching for the right things, they don't have the right vocabulary, they kind of know, well, it's something that's related to this thing, but it might not even be a synonym that they're putting in, but because we have these relationships, we can get them to the right place. It also gives us that ability to address multiple overlapping subject areas or similar areas that might use words in a somewhat different manner. I've worked with a lot of customers where they're like, yeah, we have these terms and they mean different things depending on which part of our company you're in. Right? So this thesaurus is going to give us the ability to associate the right definitions, the right terms with the right areas within our company, that type of thing. This area of transportation, then we still have our broader and narrower. We have transportation, we have automobiles, we have types of automobiles, we have these narrower things, but then we can continue to go narrower into brands. But we could also say, well, here are some equivalent synonym words for automobile. Here are some related areas if you were trying to come up with someone who could fix your car, you needed to get insurance, you might still be able to search to start with on automobile and still be taken to topics that have to do with fixing it or insuring it because of the thesaurus. Now, the disadvantages of a thesaurus, ultimately, as we continue down the complexity, these disadvantages become a lot having to do with, it's still very highly subjective, and it takes a lot more time. to really spend time saying, well, what areas of our content are going to be related, are some kind of related terms. Spending that time and really thoroughly defining that can be more than you have planned or budgeted for. It can also be difficult to know where to stop, right? Sorts of things that we could do, all sorts of relationships that we could build. And so where do we stop doing that? To the point that we can ultimately provide too much information, especially if we have a very well-defined area. We may not need to go this far, right? That if we know our users know the right words and the concepts and they just want to get right there, we don't need to bog down the whole system with a lot of additional relationships where our users will largely just kind of scratch their heads and say, well, why did you establish these relationships? This is something I should be concerned about, when ultimately they thought they really knew what they were looking for, and they did. Right, so we can overdo it, and that's going to be a trend as we continue down this path. Overdoing it becomes one of our challenges in increasing complexity. So as we move down from thesaurus with all of its relationships, we can also look then at our next level of complexity of facets, which are really looking at attributes, characteristics that describe your particular content in a variety of different ways that may or may not be related in a thesaurus. Each facet itself is probably at least a controlled vocabulary. It may also be a hierarchy. It may also have thesaurus elements in it, everything else, but it is a way to describe a specific characteristic. And it's to address the fact that items can be put into multiple, have multiple categories, multiple characteristics, multiple attributes. And so we want to be able to describe it in multiple ways, not just by traversing a tree, which there may be no relationship between those items in a tree. So it's a distinction of, how do I describe this versus where do I put this? Those are going to be some of the challenges there. So an example, here we are on All Recipes, and All Recipes has all sorts of potential facets for the way somebody might want to search for their recipes. They might be looking for recipes for a particular type of meal, dinner or breakfast or whatever. They might be doing it by the type of dish itself. Is it a cake or a salad or a soup or something like that? It could be based on, I'm looking for recipes that are gluten-free, so some kind of diet issue. It could be based on the region of the world it came from. Here, seasonal, I didn't even know that there were seasonal recipes for Labor Day. I never would have thought there were special recipes for Labor Day, but there we go. We see it there on All Recipes, that there are some seasonal considerations for some of our recipes. So they've got a lot of different possibilities. It is very unlikely that someone is going to come along and say, well, what I'm really looking for is a dinner item that is a salad that has a low-calorie dressing and came from India, and et cetera, right? They're probably not going to choose every single facet that you offer them, but it's giving a way to address the needs of multiple users, that certain users are going to be more concerned with certain characteristics when they're looking for content. And so by establishing what those facets are, we give them multiple ways. We address a larger user community of being able to say, well, this is the way I want to search. This is the way I want to navigate. Right, so that's our why do we have them? It's to address those competing ways of organizing your content. Right, there's lots of different ways to organize it. I was backtalking on the hierarchy about, well, why did we choose men, women's, kids on pants, and then casual dress? Right, we could look at those as two different attributes instead, and not necessarily even have them as a relationship in a hierarchy. It lets users find the information based on whatever characteristics is important to them. And it also enables things like a filter, like we're seeing here, like on a shopping site, of being able to narrow our list of search results to say, oh, well, only show me ones that have to do with this particular facet, so that we get a smaller list of items. Now, facets aren't aren't as popular as we think they might be in technical communication and shopping. It makes a lot of sense. People are, willing to do some comparisons and turn things on and off. In technical content, they tend to want to just say, I want to look at this list of results, look at the top 2 or 3, find what I'm looking for, and if I don't, they're less likely to play with the facets than they are to just go back and do another search. So we do have to balance that concept, but depending on how we implement those facets, are we giving them some those facet choices to set up in their profile in the first place so they can set up preferences? Are we doing it as a part of the advanced search at the beginning so they can choose the facets before they ever hit search, and not just showing it after they see the search results? Those implementation strategies would be where you might have better look with facets than just showing them at the end. The advantages of facets, again, allows us to classify our content in a variety of different ways rather than in some kind of just given hierarchical, narrower, broader way. We can just say here are a whole bunch of different unrelated characteristics that we are able to categorize our content by. So it gives us a richer description of the content that we have, gives us more flexibility in terms of meeting our users' needs. It also can help us potentially reveal gaps in our content, right? Here are some values that we've determined in terms of characteristics, and then we discover, well, we have no content for this particular characteristic or this combination of characteristics. And so it allows us to do some maybe analysis to say, should we or should we not have this particular content covered in this kind of combination? Now, that same thing becomes a disadvantage as well, that it can be difficult to predict what's going to be the result if my users do play with my facets a lot and just turn on a whole bunch of different check marks. Will they actually find something, or will they have to start backing out of their different selections of facets until they can find some kind of content? So while it can reveal the holes, it can be hard to figure out what those holes are. Ultimately, because we're categorizing this information in many, many ways, we're very likely going to have to tag our content multiple times in multiple categories. And so that can be a time-consuming process. There's definitely that balance that needs to happen of how much time are we spending for our authors to tag all of these characteristics versus the return on investment, if you will, of how much the users are actually using those characteristics that they are really important to the user. Depending on how big your content corpus is, it can actually be difficult to find a common set of characteristics that would apply to everything. So oftentimes you may say, well, here I've got a bunch of basically optional metadata that I might be trying to apply because it's not going to apply in every single situation. But these characteristics will apply to some subset of our content, some other characteristics will apply to different subset of our content, but whether we can actually find characteristics that go across the entire spectrum of our content could be a difficult thing. And there's not, at this point in the complexity spectrum, there's really no explicit relationship between these facets. We have independent facets that have no particular implication or inference. We could potentially have a facet of choose your product and a facet of choose a feature, and those aren't necessarily linked, so that potentially somebody could choose a product and a feature combination that just flat out doesn't exist, right? We don't offer that because there's no implication that that those two facets are tied to each other, that only these features show up if they've chosen this product. And so it's that designing of even your facet architecture of, in that particular case, you might want to have had that facet be a tree, right? So here's my product. Once I choose my product, I can choose my feature here within that single facet, as opposed to separate facets that had no relationship there. And again, easy to go overboard. This example that I have, just lots and lots of, what is that, about eight different items, and it still goes on and on beyond where I've got, and it has show mores and all sorts of things in there. So it's easy to overwhelm the user with, hey, you can narrow it this way and this way and this way, and you can search in all these different manners. So again, it's that balance of how much the users really need. Our last piece on this spectrum is the word ontology, which ultimately gives us the inference that I was just talking about. So it is establishing more of these relationships between categories and terms that we have in all these other aspects of the taxonomy spectrum. We can talk about what kind of relationship we have, and that allows us to do some inference. So my pictorial example here is, all those kind of logic puzzles that you might have had to solve as a child or something. If I know that lemon is a citrus fruit, and I know that citrus fruits grow on trees, then I can make the inference that lemons grow on trees. And so ultimately, from a tagging perspective and so forth, if I have a good ontology in place, I could tag my content just for lemons. And if somebody was saying, I'm looking for content that has to do with fruit that grows on trees, lemons would show up. Or if I was looking for just citrus fruit, lemons would show up in my search, not because I had tagged content as being citrus fruit or growing on trees, but because all the relationships that were defined in my ontology would allow me to infer different criteria, different facets were related to other facets in a particular manner that would let my search be much more rich, even though I haven't spent a lot of time maybe tagging all of that content. So there are a lot of ontologies, public ontologies that are out there to help you take advantage of linking to other types of lists that follow the same structures. So for example, the music ontology, if many different sites that are using the music ontology lets content be linked together, it lets the different people's own lists be linked to other lists in order to be able to create an intelligent network of information that is available for people to use, even from your site, even though you might not have all of those different nodes in your own taxonomy. And so we take a look at it kind of in a reality here is that from a music perspective, I might have a website that is CD Now that really is basically saying, hey, here's your albums. Appalachian Journey is an album, and it's it says her author, performer, whatever is Yo-Yo Ma, right? And so I can get that information here. Well, I have a different ontology that I didn't create that's called All Music, and it tells me that Yo-Yo Ma is a musician and was born on this date and was born in Paris, right? Well, now I have another ontology that is saying, well, Paris is a geographic one. That's Paris is in France, and it's a city, city in France. And I have the Weather Channel that says, here's the weather in Paris. So, if all this is all linked together in a way that my intelligent search could traverse, then I could theoretically say, show me music albums that were created by people who were born in locations where 62 degrees Fahrenheit is their average temperature. Now, I don't know why I would ever do that. Maybe I might do something like, hey, I'm interested in the music of musicians who were born in France, right? Okay, and so that would be, here's my various links of, okay, I need to establish somebody who was born in France and is a musician and has a music album, right? So all of those linking together would help me find Yo-Yo Ma or find Appalachian Journey or something like that, even though I'm not in charge of all of these different taxonomies, but because I have tagged things in particular ways, I'm able to take advantage of other ones, right? So it's adding intelligence to our content where it is the semantic web. It is that the building the intelligence into our search engines to be able to traverse different taxonomies and link information that other taxonomies know into ours, right? That becomes that semantic web, that becomes the ontology that we're really talking about here. So the advantages of an ontology is that it makes vast amounts of data that's currently unavailable to us, right? Accessible to us, understandable by artificial intelligence, and synthesizing all of that content ultimately together. And so it connects all of the information in a way that it becomes more and more usable in a variety of different types of applications, integrating information from a variety of different sources, and it doesn't all have to come from us. Right? We can take advantages of other things. So like here's LinkedIn, right? Well, LinkedIn uses an ontology of friend of a friend, an ontology that describes people and their activities and their jobs and that type of stuff to be able to locate people who might be, somebody that you would, I'm looking for all the people living in Europe that are an acquaintance, one of my acquaintances, or that type of thing, where you can find a lot of information through that type of an ontology. Now, the disadvantages ultimately is still practical feasibility of it right now. There is, from the idea of the semantic web, there's so much information out there. There's so much duplicate information out there. There's so much conflicting information out there. How do you really know what to connect to and what is good source and that type of thing? Kind of brings into account whether this is really practically feasible on a large scale. There's, of course, vagueness of terms not being used the same way in every single case. There's, of course, vagueness of queries and as well as content. There's the uncertainty principles of precise concepts that have different values, right, depending on the person who has created the content. There's inconsistencies in ontologies when it's coming from different separate sources. So how are you linking into that? There's the credibility issues that I already talked about of people who might deliberately mislead or accidentally mislead. How do you determine integrity? So, you're not just going to go out there and say, oh yeah, I just want to connect to everything possible, but it does open up some potential possibilities. There'll be questions of security and privacy in an ontology. And really, it's this idea of semantic web. It's been around for a while, but I would still say in the grand scheme of things, it's still in its infancy and not really fully supported yet. So what form do you need? Well, it really depends on what you're using it for. If all we're really talking about is consistency in writing, you're probably good with a controlled vocabulary. As we start to add entitlements and navigations and findability, then a lot of these the synonyms, the hierarchy, the facets, the thesaurus, those are things that are going to help you control how much content is being displayed in search results to your users. And so you might want to have better definition around those things, higher complexity in your taxonomical form. And ultimately, if we're really moving down that path of even just something as simple as chatbots or whatever, you're going to want more of those intelligent pieces that can really dissect what is the user really looking for, connecting to other pieces of information that can help your search engine parse what is being asked for and find the right answers. So you really have to start your question with what am I planning on using it for? Move through the what do my users need as a result of that? How much detail do they need? How many search results are we going to want to be showing at them? How are they going to want to navigate through those search results? All of that of your user preferences, are all going to factor in to which form you need. Okay, so that is my high level overview. Rick, I don't know if you wanted to chime into any of those definitions at this point, but I think we're ready for questions.
No, I think that covered it very, very well. I think the one thing we could have mentioned is the idea of folksonomies.
That's true.
Just another thing whereby you're throwing the whole thing more open to the users to create their own tags for the data. And a good example of that would be Facebook. So the way people and Twitter, people are making up their own tags for information. So they do work. It is out there. It is in use, this idea of folksonomies. I don't think there's something that works particularly well if you're trying to find the exact right thing. But it is another way of marking up data that is in use. So I would think we should move to questions now, Dawn. Thank you.
Great, Kathy. Sorry, Kathy. I see in your video that you were.
I swallowed wrong, just at the wrong moment. Thanks, Dawn. That was great. And Rick, for your comments. We do have a couple questions, some really interesting ones too. So when you first started out, you talked about the controlled vocabulary. Anu wants to know, does simplified technical English qualify as a controlled vocabulary?
Well, it certainly supports it. Oh, Rick, did you want to answer that?
Well, I feel I'm just sitting here.
Go ahead.
Maybe I'll chip in first, and then you can chip in second. So,
Absolutely.
simplified technical English is itself a controlled vocabulary, but you've got to look at where it comes from. So it originated really from ISPEC 2200, which was a standard to support aviation, which in itself has really, I think, been surpassed now to S1000D. So, two old XML standards. And it's more about influencing how people create content rather than how they find content. So you use simplified English rules because it's going to make translating, originally it was for making technical manual translation easier and more accurate, because by eliminating a lot of the language and terms that are used in English that don't translate well into other languages. So it is a controlled vocabulary, but not, you can use some of the ideas of it to help you create your vocabulary for searching, but it's not really what it's there for, would be my theory. So
Sure.
Would you agree or disagree?
I largely agree. I would add to that one of the things about simplified technical English is that while it has a list of controlled vocabulary that comes with it for certain terminology, it also has a set of rules associated with it for you to create your own specific set of controlled vocabulary that becomes part of your simplified technical English implementation. So you are able to add words to the controlled vocabulary to cover your specific areas, as long as you're following the rules that it establishes. And so it does some things like not only is it a specific preferred term, it's also a specific preferred part of speech as well. So if you had a word like even something like mine, right? Here's a noun, there's a coal mine, or I could verb it, I could mine some coal, right? Simplified technical English isn't going to let you do that. It's going to say that not only is this your controlled word, it's your controlled word in a specific part of speech as well. So it definitely has some rigidity to it to help also from some of the advantages that controlled vocabulary I talked about, things like translation and that type of stuff. It helps with that as well.
Okay. What about your synonym ring? How do you communicate that to the users?
Go ahead. Yeah, Rick, I will stop answering, let you answer first.
I mean, the idea behind that is you don't need to communicate that really to your users. You're anticipating that they may not use the term Coke when they're searching for pop, or They may use the word pop when they're searching for Coke. So it's the anticipation that's there to enhance the searchability because it is in place more.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We're not necessarily telling them that. We talked about the disadvantage being that there could be some confusion of, oh, here, my top match doesn't even have the word in it, for example, or something like that. I'm not seeing that word highlighted. And, in that type of case, if I've got control over my search results page, I might put some kind of a note that says something to the effect of, matches on synonyms are also being included, or give them the option. Depending on how sophisticated my and how much control I have over my search engine include synonyms or not, right? To be able to give them some control so they know they're getting some synonyms results in there to explain why they might not see the term. So that might be how I would communicate it, would be to give them that, in particular, that control of yes, include synonyms, or no, don't.
Okay. You talked about faceted search, and you talked about how you can narrow your search down, but before you even get to the faceted search, does having one enhance your searchability before that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I kind of alluded to it in that the where we put our facets can definitely improve the usability of things. So if I do more of an advanced search in the first place, where I can say, as a user, I can say I'm searching for this word, but only within these various contexts, whatever I might choose to put onto the search screen. Users tend to be more inclined to do that up front. I'll take the time to set up my search and choose my facets, but once I click the word search, you better give me something that I really want, right? But they tend to do more of that setup at the beginning, or be more willing to do it the setup at the beginning than they do at the end, actually. So the facets can have good value ahead of the search. Also, I mentioned potentially in user preferences, if you have that type of a system where you can, your users can say, well, I am using this version of this product, or I'm this type of user, and so those facets are already pre-applied when they do a search.
Okay, so how does AI use this taxonomy type information to help information retrieval?
So Rick, I'm being very quiet to let you, because I remembered I was supposed to do that. So
I'm thinking that's a really interesting question, but
it is, yeah.
I've sort of moved from the consultancy side more to sort of working with a single product or set of products, and I'm not sure what is actually happening with AI and that type of taxonomy information, what people are doing. I've not come across, put it this way, I've not come across evidence of it being used a lot, but I may be too far removed from that, and that I don't know if you've come across that more. But,
Sure. From the artificial intelligence perspective, I mean, I'm actually, even though I make some money doing taxonomy and teaching that, I ultimately anticipate in the future, not today, but I do anticipate in the future that our natural language processors are going to be enough that our computers will be smart enough to be able to just figure out what applies and what doesn't. But what does taxonomy do today for them is it still is provides a way to traverse through relationships, so that so the artificial intelligence is parses that query into specific terms and determines things like intent of, what I mean by intent is that if I'm asking a question that says, how much is this, then I know that I should be looking for content that has to do with, with pricing, versus what is this? I know I should be looking for content that is more descriptive, right? So those kinds of relationships, that type of association of these words mean these things, these are associated with this type of content, what taxonomy and specifically ontologies are doing with those relationships is giving the ability for the machine to parse things down and select the right phrase, you know, in the case of a chatbot or something, based on the way things have been parsed. And I would say that probably the best examples of how artificial intelligence is using taxonomy right now is in some of the forms of chatbots, of some of the better chatbots that have those kinds of relationships built. But yeah, the taxonomy right now is being used to simply to be able to parse and find what branches of the you know, one taxonomy, how is that related to another branch from somebody else, and how do I build that relationship so that I can do something like, you know, even if I have a site that just has, here are my, here's a list of all the governors of the various states, and then I want to say, well, tell me which ones are Republicans. I might not have said that, but if I've got the associations to be able to go to some other site that has, here is the list of, you know, who's Republicans and who's you know, just politicians that are Republicans and Democrats, then I can combine that piece of information with my information and be able to parse my list down to say these are the Republican governors, right? Even though I didn't have that information on my site. So that's how artificial intelligence is using those different things, but there's got to be that connection to be able to say, I can get this information from this place or that place.
Okay, we got a couple of questions on resources and technology, which I know you're going to talk about on the follow-up webinar, but we'll go ahead and answer them or ask those questions, and then you could say, stay tuned if you want, or you can answer them either way. The first one is, are there any learning resources you would recommend for diving deeper into ontology development?
There's some good books out there. There are.
Let's see, can you put them
I
in?
don't like recommending individual books. There's an interesting book by David Haynes on metadata and for information management and retrieval, which is worth a read if people haven't read it yet. It's also has the advantage, I've just pulled it off my bookshelf actually, has the advantage of being only 180 odd pages long, which is better than some of the huge tomes that we find ourselves working through. But the resources are out there, and you know, read more and engage the experts as well. You know, Dawn has really sort of downplayed her expertise, I feel, here, because you know, she's one of the leading people in this field, and that's why these companies exist. I come to this now from a vendor, but I always recommend that people go and talk to the experts who've read the books, and more than one of the 186 pages. It's just a book that I like.
Why don't we do this, Kathy, and promise everybody that we will prepare a reading list for our April 6th webinar. So we will have a ready reading list, and not just talk off the top of our head of some good resources. So we'll have some websites and some recommended books, and maybe even some.
That beats me quickly looking at my bookshelf.
Yeah,
so we will put a reading list.
That's great, and it looks like folks are starting to put some of their recommendations in the chat. So if you're listening and have a book that you want Dawn and Rick to maybe include in the next session, go ahead and put it in the chat. Yeah. So thanks, Ingrid, for that. All right, so here's one. Can you identify some technology tools and solutions that people in the TechCom industry are using to establish these various strategies? For example, terminology databases, common core metadata like the Dublin Core, and so forth. In particular, they'd also like you to touch on the idea of thinking as an indexer when considering how people search for information.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. I'm not going to answer the question with what I'm about to say, but I love that point that was just made about thinking of as an indexer, because in my opinion, that's absolutely a a key skill, and that I oftentimes call professional indexers the blockbusters of the technical communication industry. And what I mean by that is, you know, Blockbuster, the video store, ultimately didn't quite make the cut of moving from, you know, physical stores with their physical tapes and things that you had to rent, and you know, so they lost out to other, you know, Netflix or whatever, if they didn't, you know, anticipate the industry. And so it is a derogatory thing for me to say that to indexers, but I think that's what happened, is that indexers didn't make that transition effectively to say, you know what, creating metadata and creating keyword strategies and all those things are actually exactly what we were doing as indexers. And so, you know, those people who, you know, I mean, to be fair, there are definitely people who made that transition, but that's, to me, that's a critical aspect of having a well-defined strategy for taxonomy or ontology is to look at those skills that indexers had. I encourage people to look at library science degrees, and actually I know many people in this industry are going and getting their library sciences degrees to really become more of a professional taxonomist at this point. And I think, you know, a lot of companies should be looking at hiring that type of person or skill, because the reason that we had indexers, you know, 30 years ago is because it wasn't something that the writers necessarily did well, right? In terms of indexing, what's the most important thing, understanding what are users going to be looking for, what words are they going to be looking for. And so the indexers would take that document after it was done and make those types of determinations and create a really robust index. And really that's what we still need to be doing when we're talking about a taxonomy as well. So I definitely agree with whoever, you know, made that point. And so, you know, yeah, I would definitely suggest things like a library science degree, but the other part of the question was things like tools and so forth. And I know we'll definitely be talking about some of the tools next time. There are a lot of taxonomy management systems, many of which integrate with your component content management systems that are Digita ones. There are several tools that will integrate, and we'll address some of those specific relationships in our second half of this.
Okay. Rick, Dawn was a little bit too quick there. She got in before you, but do you have something to add there?
No, I think that was it. That was, I mean, in terms of the tools, the idea of making this a two-part session was, once the first part to lay the ground and explain everything. And on the 6th of April, I'll be taking you through the same thing and looking at how the different tools can be used to address the different types of detail that we looked at today. So we'll be going through all of those. There was a question, I think, as well, looking where someone didn't catch what I said. So I think that was regarding the Simonin rings and whether or not, how do you communicate that to your users? The whole point is you don't.
No. It actually was when you were talking about the folksology.
Oh, the
Facebook.
Taxonomy.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's when they put that in. Yeah, I was getting to that. Yeah. So we'll cover that on the next one. Okay.
I think.
So, yeah, there's.
My email address is on the screen at the moment, so anybody can email either Dawn or myself with any questions, and we can give you more in-depth answers.
And there are 2 more questions that I think we want to try to get to.
Okay.
If you have time.
I was going to say I could expand on the folksonomy a little bit more if you think is that a question, or you want to get to the other ones?
It's totally up to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 more. We got about 10 more minutes.
Okay.
One, I think it may be a short answer, but I don't know. If you were doing data mining, which approach do you think is most effective, a taxonomy or ontology? Or ontology, excuse me.
Well, if I'm doing data mining, and I'm going to interpret that question as being, I've got a whole bunch of content, and so I'm going to go mine my content and figure out what are the terms, what are the categories, what are the things that are already present in my content. Ultimately, it's going to fall easier into more of the hierarchical or faceted types of strategies. And then once you've got those, then you can start to look for those inferences and so forth in an ontology. But we're going to, it's not necessarily, your content isn't necessarily defined to have a lot of those relationships. I mean, you might have related topics that might help you identify it, but my approach would be simply to say, okay, here are these terms, here are these concepts, here are the categories of things that and terms that I'm pulling, and do that initial sorting of here's the data that I have pulled out. How am I going to group them into these various categories? Get that down and tested, right? So there's a lot of we haven't really talked a lot about testing, but a lot of testing strategies here of have I sorted these things right? Have I put them in the right categories? Are they meaningful to my users? Do that type of validating of them all being separate concepts before I start to try to put the inferences in, where we say, okay, because I've tagged this content this way, or I've sorted it into this way, it also implies that it's going to be sorted this other way over here, and there's that relationship. So I would say start, just the reason that we present it as an increasing complexity is start simpler, even with your data mining, and then build the relationships later.
Rick, any other comments on that?
No, none. I wouldn't add anything.
I'm gonna add something though, because some of you may have missed that Dawn is teaching a taxonomy workshop, and she'll talk about some of these things and practical of how to actually build your taxonomies, and that's going to be starting in May. I think it's May 20th. This is the date that starts, and I think it's once a week. Dawn, is that what you're doing?
Yeah, once a week. I think it's eight weeks.
8 sessions. So got to put that plug in. All right, here's one final question on, I think it's also tools related, but ontologies and knowledge graphs can be developed to create a semantic web to unite content retrieval delivery from across disparate silos and across your enterprise. Right. Mike's question is, do we have any idea which commercial content delivery heads, if any, can consume ontologies or knowledge graphs that we've created in tools such as Watson and Pool Party? Those are just a few. Or are we still entirely in a roll your own state of affairs?
Without naming products today, it is, actually I will name one product because I know that it does do it, but certainly from within a Bluestream perspective, with support for ontologies, there is full support for OWL2, and so which is web ontology language. So if you're creating your ontologies in a OWL2 environment, then that's possible to import into several CCMSs. Some of those CCMSs actually have a delivery capability, and therefore that same metadata that's coming in on the back of the ontology is available at the delivery point. So we'll go, the whole point of the next session is to go more into what tools are out there. What can you do with something like Pool Party? How does that work? How do you then integrate that into your CCMS, and then how do you integrate that into the key thing, which is the delivery? And so that the whole point is we'll go into that in more detail and talk about what some of the systems are that are out there and how do they work, and give some examples and a reading list, obviously. Dawn, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it, but yes, there are definitely tools that will ingest like Rick was saying, OWL, which is your ontology language, and integrate together with your CCMSs, your data CCMSs. There's a couple, and so we will definitely be talking about that. And as Rick said, then the delivery platforms that you're exporting out to can then use those same things. So it's not just theory. But it's also, I will also say it's also not just commonplace either. but so I'm not, I would say that the question that was asked of, is it really just roll your own? There's still a lot of roll your own out there. But there's, developments happen every day, and there definitely are tools that can get you where you want to go at this point. You may have to pay a little bit of money for them, so there's that as well.
All right, it turns out we do have some time, and I think people will stay on because they're curious to get that a little bit more in depth on folksonomy question that was asked. And then also, how related to that, how can you use your users' failed searches to improve your taxonomy?
Absolutely. Okay. So so to clarify folksonomy, as what Rick was saying, is the idea of folksonomy is that it is built out of tradition and folklore or whatever of that's where the word comes from, of that it's really coming from the user community as opposed to you having developed a specific controlled vocabulary or a consistent hierarchy yourself. It's how are your users referring to things? What are the terms that they use? And Rick mentioned like Twitter, right? We have hashtags all over the place, right? If you want to just create your own hashtag, that's what you do. You just put hashtag and you put a term in there, and then people can all make comments that are associated with that particular hashtag. So that's a very common kind of folksonomy, that how are your users referring to your content? What are the terminologies that they're using when they're categorizing things? What are people doing? And maybe help sites where people are posting questions, how are they getting categorized there? You're not having anything to do with it. It's not following your hierarchy or your taxonomy. It's a folksonomy that you could potentially mine there to see how other people are categorizing your content and referring to it. So that's that in a nutshell. So that plus the failed searches certainly help build other things that we should be considering. So absolutely, without a doubt, you should be taking advantage of any kind of analytics that your website might provide to you about what were the searches that, what were the terms that users looked for, and where did they go as a result of that, and in your own opinion, is that where they should have gone? And then of course you can also look at data that would say, did they stay on that site so they thought they found the right place, or did they bounce back to the search results and try something else? Did they exit, meaning that they probably did find what they were needing? So we can gather a lot of metrics from those kinds of analytics to say, are people finding the content that they need based on the words that they're entering? And if they're not, if they're not going to the place that we think that they should, or if they aren't getting any matches, then it's a consideration of, okay, here are some terms that people are using. Where do they belong? Do they belong in part of our controlled vocabulary? Do they belong as synonyms? Is there some kind of relationship we need to define with them? What is the, a lot more analysis necessary to say, this is the, why is this word here? Why are they using this word? And how should we incorporate it into our overall structure? Right, but it's definitely a source of information that is useful when you're first building it. If you can gather the data of what are people looking for, but it's something that you should be checking all the time, because vocabularies and search strategies and everything changes so much. Really, that is something I actually encourage my clients to do, even on a monthly basis, is look at the analytics, but also do their own searches, right? Have you tried, if you think about content that you've written, have you gone out to Google or to your portal or wherever people are getting their information and put a question in that theoretically your content should answer, and see, does your content actually show up? Right? Is it the top match that you would expect them to find? And do that kind of testing on a clean computer, so it doesn't have any of your biases or preferred sites or anything else kind of stored in the background, but on something that is cleaned up all the time. But go and do that type of a search and see, are you still one of the top matches? And if not, let's do some more research to find out what has changed, what tweaks do we need to make overall to our taxonomy, to our metadata, to our SEO, all of those things to put us back in the right place in the search result.
All right, Rick, anything else on that?
No, the only thing I'd add is it's important for everybody to always look at the data. You know, any projects you're doing, measure your data now. If you're thinking of going down the route of doing more, creating a new taxonomy, or doing some things, or moving to an ontology, doing something different, you should be tracking your data at the moment. You should know how many people are going to your site. You should know bounce rates. You need to have some data there so that when you do your project, you can actually see whether it's improved things or it's made it worse. Hopefully it will have improved things, obviously. But you should always know these figures, how, you know, you can't stress that too much, because when you go to management, you need to be able to say, this is where we are now, and that's where we're going to get to. So data, always be looking at data.
Yep, agree 100%.
All right, any closing remarks, you guys? Other than we'll see you on April 6th.
Yep, I encourage you all to come again on April 6th, and you'll get to listen to Rick a little bit more than me, but we'll talk about the technologies, and we'll have that list of resources, and I'll add to that tools. So a reading list, a list of tools, everything like that. We'll have some lists that we'll distribute with that webinar.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your time. And thank you to CIDM for hosting this as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.